The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Bragg shooting range as Colonel Marcus, Chuckles Henderson, adjusted his military cap and checked his watch. At 52 years old, he had earned his nickname not from his sense of humor, but from his habit of chuckling dismissively at what he considered civilian foolishness. Today promised to be another one of those days. A bright yellow sedan pulled into the parking area, music thumping from its speakers. Colonel Henderson shook his head as he watched a teenage girl step out, her long brown hair tied in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a pink hoodie that read "Future CEO" in glittery letters. Behind her emerged what appeared to be her father, a nervous-looking man in his 40s carrying a large duffel bag. "You've got to be kidding me," Henderson muttered under his breath. He had seen this scenario countless times before. Wealthy parents trying to impress their spoiled children by booking expensive shooting experiences at military facilities. The girl probably wanted to post photos on social media to show off to her friends. The teenager, whose name was Sarah Martinez according to the reservation paperwork, bounced toward the registration desk with an enthusiasm that made Henderson's jaw clench. Her father followed more cautiously, constantly adjusting the heavy bag on his shoulder. "Hi there," Sarah called out cheerfully to the desk sergeant. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I have a reservation for the advanced marksmanship course today." Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his paperwork, glanced at Colonel Henderson, then back at Sarah. "Advanced marksmanship? Miss, that course is designed for military personnel and law enforcement officers. Are you sure you don't want the basic civilian shooting experience?" Sarah's smile never wavered. "No, thank you, Sergeant. I specifically requested the advanced course. I believe my application was approved by Colonel Henderson himself." Henderson stepped forward, his boots clicking against the concrete floor. He had indeed approved the application, but only because it came with a substantial donation to the base's recreational fund. Money was money, and if some rich teenager wanted to waste her father's cash, that was their business. "Miss Martinez," Henderson said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in the military. "The advanced marksmanship course includes precision shooting at distances up to 800 meters, multiple weapon systems, and scenarios based on actual combat situations." "This isn't a game or a social media opportunity?" Sarah's father shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Sarah, maybe we should consider the basic course first. The colonel makes a good point." But Sarah remained undaunted. "Colonel Henderson, I appreciate your concern, but I've done my research. I understand exactly what the course entails, and I'm prepared for the challenge." Henderson studied her for a moment. There was something in her eyes that didn't match her youthful appearance and casual clothing, a steadiness that seemed unusual for someone her age. Still, he had seen confident teenagers before, and they usually ended up crying or giving up within the first hour. "Very well," he said with a slight chuckle. "But understand that there are no participation trophies here. If you can't handle the course requirements, you'll be moved to basic training immediately. No refunds." "That's perfectly fair, Colonel," Sarah replied, extending her hand for a handshake. Her grip was firm and steady. As they walked toward the equipment area, Henderson noticed that Sarah's father seemed more nervous than she did. The man kept glancing around at the military personnel and hardware as if he were out of his element. Sarah, on the other hand, moved with a confidence that bordered on familiarity. "First time on a military base?" Henderson asked the father. "Yes, sir," the man replied. "I'm David Martinez. I run an accounting firm in Charlotte." This whole thing was Sarah's idea. She's been talking about it for months. Henderson nodded, filing away the information. Rich accountant's daughter looking for thrills. It fit the pattern perfectly. At the equipment station, Instructor Staff Sergeant Williams began laying out the gear. Military-grade hearing protection, safety glasses, and various firearms ranging from standard-issue pistols to precision rifles. Sarah examined each piece of equipment with what appeared to be genuine interest, rather than the typical civilian mixture of fear and excitement. "Have you handled firearms before, Miss Martinez?" Staff Sergeant Williams asked. "Some," Sarah answered simply. Henderson chuckled again. "Some" usually meant a few trips to an indoor range with Daddy's hunting rifle. He had seen it all before. The first phase of the advanced course involved weapon familiarization and safety protocols. Most civilians spent at least an hour in this section, learning basic handling and safety rules. Henderson expected Sarah to struggle with the military-style instruction and detailed procedures. Instead, she listened attentively as Staff Sergeant Williams demonstrated proper weapon handling. But when it came time for her to repeat the procedures, she moved with unexpected precision. Her stance was correct, her grip firm, and her muzzle discipline flawless. "Interesting," Williams muttered to Henderson. "She's not holding it like a first-timer." Henderson observed more closely as Sarah field-stripped and reassembled a standard-issue pistol in what appeared to be record time for a civilian. When Williams asked her to demonstrate the safety protocols, she recited them word for word while performing each action correctly. "Where exactly did you learn to handle weapons, Miss Martinez?" Henderson asked, his tone becoming more serious. Sarah looked up from the reassembled pistol in her hands. "My grandfather taught me, Colonel. He was a Marine." "What unit?" Henderson asked automatically. "2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. He served 3 tours in Vietnam." Henderson's expression shifted slightly. Marines took weapons training seriously, and if her grandfather had been properly trained, he might have passed on real skills rather than casual shooting experience. Still, knowing how to safely handle a weapon was different from actually being able to use it effectively. "Well then," Henderson said, "let's see what Grandpa taught you." As they moved toward the firing line, Henderson noticed that Sarah's father had grown even more quiet. The man seemed to be watching his daughter with a mixture of pride and something else. Concern, perhaps, or maybe surprise. The shooting range stretched out before them, with targets set at various distances. The closest targets were at 25 meters, with others positioned at 50, 100, 200, and 400 meters. For the advanced course, shooters were expected to demonstrate proficiency at all distances with multiple weapon systems. Henderson had seen grown men struggle with the 200-meter shots using the precision rifles. He fully expected Sarah to have trouble beyond the 50-meter mark, if she could even handle that distance effectively. What he didn't expect was what happened next. Sarah approached the 25-meter firing line with the standard-issue Beretta M9 pistol. Staff Sergeant Williams had explained the course of fire. 15 rounds, standing position, no support. For most civilians, this was challenging enough to keep them busy for the entire morning. Colonel Henderson positioned himself behind the firing line with his arms crossed, ready to watch another overconfident teenager learn about reality. He had his stopwatch ready, though he doubted Sarah would need timing. Most first-time shooters took their time with each shot, carefully aiming and often missing the target entirely. "Range is hot," Williams called out. "Shooter may commence firing when ready." Sarah took her stance, and Henderson immediately noticed something different. Her feet were positioned perfectly, her body balanced, and her grip on the weapon was exactly as it should be. This wasn't the uncertain fumbling he typically saw from civilians. The first shot rang out, and Henderson instinctively looked downrange toward the target. Even from his position, he could see the hole in the center ring. Beginner's luck, he thought. The second shot followed quickly, then the third. Sarah was firing at a steady rhythm, not the hesitant pace of someone unsure about what they were doing. Henderson pulled out his binoculars to get a better look at the target. All 3 shots were grouped tightly in the center of the bullseye. "Jesus," Williams muttered beside him. Shot after shot rang out in steady succession. Sarah's breathing was controlled, her stance unchanged, her trigger pull smooth and consistent. By the time she had fired all 15 rounds, Henderson was staring through his binoculars at something he had rarely seen, even from experienced soldiers. The target looked like it had been hit by a single, slightly larger bullet. All 15 rounds were clustered in the center ring, with most of them actually touching each other. "Time," Williams announced, looking at his stopwatch. 43 seconds. Henderson lowered his binoculars slowly. 43 seconds for 15 precision shots was faster than most of his trained soldiers could manage, and none of them could match that level of accuracy on their first attempt. "Bring the target in," Henderson ordered. As the automated target system pulled the paper target back to the firing line, Henderson found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about Sarah Martinez. The target confirmed what he had seen through the binoculars. The grouping was impossibly tight for someone who claimed to have only some experience with firearms. Sarah's father was staring at the target with his mouth slightly open. "Sarah, where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah simply shrugged. "Grandpa was a good teacher." Henderson looked at the teenager with new interest. "Miss Martinez, exactly how much time did you spend with your grandfather?" "Every summer from age 8 to 16, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "He lived on a ranch in Montana. He said if I was going to learn to shoot, I was going to learn to do it right." "And he taught you to shoot like this?" Henderson gestured at the target.
"He taught me to be consistent," Sarah said.
He always said that shooting wasn't about being strong or fast. It was about being precise and repeatable. Williams was examining the target more closely. "Colonel, this grouping would qualify her for the base shooting team. I've never seen anything like this from a civilian." Henderson was beginning to realize that Sarah Martinez was not the typical rich teenager he had assumed her to be. But the pistol portion was just the beginning of the advanced course. The real challenges lay ahead. "All right, Miss Martinez," Henderson said. "Let's move to the 100-meter rifle range." The rifle portion of the course used M4 carbines, the standard infantry weapon. Most civilians found the rifle intimidating and difficult to handle accurately. The targets at 100 meters appeared much smaller than those at 25 meters, and the shooting position was prone, which many people found uncomfortable. Sarah accepted the M4 from Williams and immediately began checking the weapon, examining the sight settings and testing the trigger pull. Again, her actions were those of someone familiar with the equipment rather than someone seeing it for the first time. "Have you fired an M4 before?" Henderson asked. "No, sir," Sarah replied, but Grandpa explained the principles. He said most rifles work the same way if you understand the fundamentals. Henderson found himself curious about this grandfather. Marines were known for their marksmanship, but what Sarah was demonstrating went beyond basic military training. At the 100-meter line, Sarah took her prone position behind the rifle. Henderson watched as she adjusted her body position, checked her sight picture, and controlled her breathing. Everything about her technique was textbook perfect. "This course of fire is 20 rounds in 20 minutes, Williams explained. "Take your time and focus on accuracy." Sarah nodded and settled behind the rifle. Henderson noticed that she spent several moments just looking through the scope, familiarizing herself with the sight picture and the target. Then she fired her first shot. Even at 100 meters, Henderson could see through his binoculars that the shot had hit the center ring. Sarah worked the bolt smoothly and fired again. Another center hit. What impressed Henderson most was her rhythm. She wasn't rushing, but she wasn't dawdling either. Each shot was deliberate and controlled, with just enough time between shots to let the rifle settle and reacquire the target. By the 10th shot, Henderson realized that Sarah was not just hitting the center of the target consistently, she was hitting virtually the same spot every time. At 100 meters, this level of precision was remarkable even for trained soldiers. "Sir," Williams said quietly, "she's shooting better than our instructors." Henderson nodded grimly. He was beginning to understand that this day was not going to unfold as he had expected. Sarah Martinez was demonstrating a level of marksmanship that challenged everything he thought he knew about civilian shooting abilities. When Sarah finished the 20-round course of fire, Henderson called for the target to be brought in. The result was even more impressive than the pistol target. 20 shots clustered in a group smaller than a silver dollar, all in the highest scoring ring. Sarah's father was now staring at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. "Sarah, I had no idea you could shoot like this." "I didn't want to make a big deal about it," Sarah said simply. "It was just something Grandpa and I did together." Henderson was starting to suspect there was more to this story than Sarah was letting on. The level of skill she was demonstrating didn't come from casual summer visits with a grandfather, no matter how well trained he might have been. "Miss Martinez," Henderson said, "I think it's time we move to the long-range precision course." The long-range course was where Henderson expected Sarah's performance to finally falter. Shooting accurately at 300, 400, and 500 meters required not just basic marksmanship skills, but an understanding of ballistics, wind reading, and advanced shooting techniques that took years to master. As they walked toward the long-range facility, Henderson found himself genuinely curious about what would happen next. For the first time in years, he was watching a civilian shooter who might actually challenge his preconceptions about what was possible. The long-range shooting facility at Fort Bragg was Colonel Henderson's pride and joy. The 500-meter range was where Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and Marine snipers came to hone their skills. The targets at these distances appeared as mere dots through most scopes, and environmental factors like wind, humidity, and temperature could dramatically affect bullet trajectory. Henderson had assumed that this would be where Sarah Martinez finally met her match. Long-range precision shooting was as much science as it was skill, requiring knowledge that couldn't be picked up during casual summer visits with a grandfather. Sarah examined the precision rifle she had been given, a military-grade bolt-action weapon equipped with a high-powered scope. She adjusted the scope settings, checked the wind flags positioned at various points down the range, and spent several minutes studying the ballistic data card attached to the rifle. "Miss Martinez," Henderson said, "this portion of the course requires you to engage targets at 300, 400, and 500 meters. You'll have 5 shots at each distance, and you'll need to account for wind drift, bullet drop, and other environmental factors." Sarah nodded, still studying the data card. "What's the ammunition specification, Colonel?" Henderson was surprised by the question. Most civilians had no idea that different ammunition types could significantly affect accuracy at long range. "Match grade 7.62 NATO, 168 grain Sierra Match King bullets." "Thank you, sir." "And what's the current wind speed and direction?" Williams checked his handheld weather instrument. "Wind is variable, averaging 8 miles per hour from the southwest, gusting to 12. Sarah processed this information while continuing to study the ballistic chart. Henderson watched her carefully, noting that she seemed to be performing calculations in her head. After a few moments, she made scope adjustments based on her computations. "Ready when you are, Miss Martinez," Henderson said, curious to see how badly she would miss the targets at these extended ranges. Sarah took her position behind the rifle, adjusting her body until she was comfortable and stable. She spent considerable time looking through the scope, studying the target and watching the wind flags. Henderson noticed that she was timing her shots to coincide with lulls in the wind. The first shot at 300 meters rang out across the range. Henderson immediately raised his binoculars to check the target. The shot had struck dead center in the bullseye. "Lucky shot," Henderson muttered, but he was beginning to doubt his own words. Sarah worked the bolt smoothly and prepared for her second shot. Again, she took her time, reading the wind and waiting for the right moment. The second shot was as precise as the first. By the time Sarah had completed all 5 shots at 300 meters, Henderson was no longer thinking about luck. Through his binoculars, he could see that all 5 shots were clustered in the center ring, with a grouping that would have impressed a trained military sniper. "Target coming in," Williams announced. When the target reached the firing line, both men stared at it in disbelief. The 5-shot group could be covered by a quarter. Sarah's father was now sitting in stunned silence, apparently unable to process what he was witnessing. "Miss Martinez," Henderson said slowly, "where exactly did your grandfather serve as a Marine?" "He was assigned to various units during his career," Sarah replied, "but he spent most of his time with Force Reconnaissance." Henderson felt a chill run down his spine. Force Reconnaissance was an elite unit, and their members received some of the most advanced marksmanship training in the military. Suddenly, Sarah's abilities were starting to make more sense. "Did he ever mention his specific training background?" Henderson pressed. Sarah hesitated for the first time since arriving at the range. "He didn't like to talk about his service much, Colonel. He just said that he learned to shoot well enough to keep himself and his Marines alive." Henderson nodded, understanding the reluctance many veterans had to discuss their wartime experiences, but he was beginning to suspect that Sarah's grandfather had been more than just a regular Marine. The 400-meter target was next, and Henderson watched with growing amazement as Sarah repeated her performance. Her shots were precise, consistent, and demonstrated a level of skill that he had rarely seen outside of elite military units. "This is impossible," Williams whispered. "She's shooting better than our best snipers." Henderson had to agree. He had trained and worked with some of the finest marksmen in the military, and Sarah was demonstrating abilities that matched or exceeded their performance. The 500-meter target was the ultimate challenge. At this distance, the target appeared tiny through the scope, and the slightest error in calculation or technique could result in a complete miss. Henderson had seen experienced soldiers struggle to hit the target at all at this range. Sarah took even more time preparing for the 500-meter shots. She carefully studied the wind flags, made additional scope adjustments, and spent several minutes just watching the environmental conditions change. When she finally took her first shot, Henderson held his breath. The shot struck the center of the target. "Unbelievable," Henderson muttered. Shot after shot, Sarah continued to demonstrate impossible accuracy. Her understanding of ballistics, wind reading, and long-range shooting techniques was clearly far beyond what any civilian should possess. When the final target was brought in, Henderson stared at it for a long moment without speaking. The 5-shot group at 500 meters was smaller than many soldiers could achieve at 100 meters. "Miss Martinez," Henderson said finally, "I need to know more about your grandfather's background." What you're demonstrating here goes far beyond normal military training. Sarah looked uncomfortable for the first time. Colonel, my grandfather made me promise never to talk about his specific assignments. He said some things were better left in the past. Henderson understood the implications. Many special operations veterans preferred to keep their service records private, especially those who had served in classified units or operations. I respect that, Henderson said. But I need you to understand that what you're doing here today is extraordinary. The level of marksmanship you're demonstrating is something we typically only see from our most elite units. Sarah nodded. Grandpa always said that shooting was a skill that could save your life or someone else's life. He wanted to make sure I learned it properly. As they prepared to move to the final phase of the course, Henderson found himself completely re-evaluating his assumptions about Sarah Martinez. She wasn't a spoiled rich teenager looking for thrills. She was a highly skilled marksman, whose abilities rivaled those of the most elite soldiers he had trained. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. The final phase of the advanced marksmanship course involved shooting scenarios designed to simulate combat conditions. Henderson was about to discover that Sarah's abilities extended far beyond static target shooting. As they walked toward the tactical shooting range, Henderson couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to Sarah's story than she was revealing. Her grandfather had clearly been an exceptional soldier, but what Sarah was demonstrating suggested training that went beyond even elite military standards. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the range, and Henderson realized that this day would be one he remembered for the rest of his career. Whatever Sarah Martinez's full story was, she had already shattered every assumption he had made about civilian shooting capabilities. The tactical shooting range was designed to simulate real-world combat scenarios. Unlike the static targets Sarah had been engaging all day, this course featured moving targets, multiple firing positions, and time constraints that challenged even experienced soldiers. Colonel Henderson had designed many of the scenarios himself, based on actual combat situations reported by Navy SEALs and other special operations units. Miss Martinez, Henderson explained as they approached the course, this final phase will test your ability to apply marksmanship skills under stress. You'll encounter multiple targets at various ranges, some stationary, some moving. You'll have to transition between different firing positions and make split-second decisions about target priority. Sarah examined the course layout, noting the various obstacles, barricades, and target positions. Her expression was focused and serious, but she showed no signs of nervousness or uncertainty. Are there any rules of engagement I should be aware of, Colonel? Sarah asked. Henderson was again surprised by her question. Rules of engagement were a military concept that most civilians wouldn't even think to ask about. Good question. In this scenario, you'll encounter both hostile and non-hostile targets. You must correctly identify threats before engaging. Hitting a non-hostile target results in automatic course failure. Sarah nodded, studying the course more carefully. Henderson noticed that she was examining sight lines, calculating distances, and identifying potential problems with the same systematic approach he had seen from his most experienced soldiers. One more thing, Henderson added. This course has a time limit. You have 12 minutes to complete the entire scenario. Most soldiers need 15 to 20 minutes on their first attempt. Understood, Colonel, Sarah replied. Staff Sergeant Williams handed Sarah a vest loaded with additional ammunition magazines. You'll start with a full magazine in the rifle, plus 4 additional magazines. Make your shots count. As Sarah strapped on the gear, Henderson positioned himself at the observation platform where he could monitor her progress throughout the course. He had a radio communication system that would allow him to provide instructions and updates as needed. Range is hot, Williams announced. Scenario begins in 3, 2, 1, execute. Sarah immediately moved toward the first firing position, a barricade that provided cover while engaging targets at the 200-meter line. Henderson watched through his binoculars as she smoothly transitioned from running to shooting position, acquiring the first target and engaging it with a well-placed shot. What impressed Henderson most was her economy of movement. There was no wasted motion, no fumbling with equipment, no hesitation. Every action was deliberate and efficient. The first target fell, and Sarah immediately identified the second threat, a moving target that crossed from left to right at approximately 150 meters. Leading a moving target required precise timing and calculation, skills that typically took soldiers months to develop. Sarah's shot caught the moving target dead center as it reached the midpoint of its travel. "Incredible," Henderson muttered into his radio to Williams. As Sarah progressed through the course, Henderson found himself witnessing a level of tactical shooting that he had rarely seen outside of elite special operations units. She moved with confidence and precision, transitioning smoothly between firing positions and engaging targets with remarkable accuracy. At the halfway point, Sarah encountered the most challenging portion of the course, a scenario designed to simulate an urban combat environment. Multiple targets appeared simultaneously at various ranges and positions, requiring her to quickly assess threats and engage them in order of priority. Henderson watched as Sarah rapidly identified and engaged 5 separate targets in less than 30 seconds. Each shot was precise and deliberate with no wasted ammunition. "Sir," Williams radioed, "she's moving through this course faster than our SEAL instructors." Henderson was beginning to accept that Sarah Martinez represented something he had never encountered before. Her abilities went far beyond what any civilian should possess, even one trained by an elite military grandfather. As Sarah approached the final phase of the course, she encountered the most complex challenge, a hostage scenario. Multiple targets appeared, but only some were legitimate threats. Others represented civilians or hostages who must not be harmed. This was where most soldiers struggled. The pressure of making split-second life-or-death decisions often led to mistakes, even among experienced personnel. Sarah paused for just a moment, assessing the situation. Then she began engaging targets with surgical precision, eliminating threats while carefully avoiding non-hostile targets. Her target identification was flawless, and her shooting was impossibly accurate under pressure. When the final target fell, Henderson checked his stopwatch. 9 minutes and 37 seconds. Sarah had completed the course faster than any civilian he had ever seen, and faster than most military personnel. As Sarah emerged from the course, Henderson noticed something that impressed him even more than her shooting skills. She wasn't breathing hard, she wasn't shaking from adrenaline, and she wasn't showing any signs of stress or exhaustion. She appeared as calm and composed as when she had started. "Miss Martinez," Henderson said as she approached, "I need to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir." "Have you received formal military or law enforcement training beyond what your grandfather taught you?" Sarah hesitated, and Henderson could see her wrestling with how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke carefully. "Colonel, my grandfather didn't just teach me to shoot during summer visits. After my parents divorced when I was 12, I went to live with him permanently. He homeschooled me, and part of that education included what he called practical life skills." Henderson felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. What kind of practical life skills? Marksmanship, tactical movement, survival training, first aid, and other skills he felt I might need someday, Sarah replied. He said the world could be a dangerous place, and he wanted to make sure I could take care of myself. "For how long did you receive this training?" Henderson asked. 4 years, Sarah answered. "From age 12 to 16. We trained almost every day." Henderson did the math in his head. 4 years of daily training by a Force Reconnaissance Marine would explain Sarah's extraordinary abilities. But it also raised new questions about why her grandfather had felt such intensive training was necessary. "Miss Martinez," Henderson said slowly, "what exactly did your grandfather do after he left the Marines?" Again, Sarah hesitated. "He worked for various government agencies, Colonel. He never gave me details about his assignments, but he traveled frequently, and sometimes he would be gone for months at a time." Henderson felt a chill of recognition. A Force Reconnaissance Marine who worked for various government agencies after his military service suggested involvement in classified operations, possibly with organizations like the CIA or other intelligence agencies. "And he trained you as if you might need these skills someday," Henderson said. Sarah nodded. "He said it was better to have skills and never need them than to need them and not have them." As they walked back toward the main building, Henderson found himself wondering what kind of life Sarah's grandfather had lived that made him feel it necessary to train his granddaughter as if she were preparing for combat operations. But one thing was certain. Sarah Martinez had just set new records at Fort Bragg that would probably never be broken. And Henderson suspected that what he had witnessed today was only a fraction of what she was capable of. Colonel Henderson sat in his office later that evening, staring at the shooting scores and times that Sarah Martinez had achieved. On his desk lay documentation that would have been unbelievable if he hadn't witnessed it himself. Sarah had not just broken the existing civilian records at Fort Bragg, she had shattered every single benchmark, including several that had been set by elite military units. Her pistol scores exceeded those of the base's competitive shooting team. Her rifle accuracy surpassed the standards required for military sniper qualification. Her tactical course time was faster than most Navy SEALs achieved on their first attempt. Most remarkably, she had accomplished all of this with the calm composure of someone who had been doing it for decades. Henderson picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he rarely used. After several rings, a familiar voice answered. "Henderson, this is unexpected. How can I help you?" "General Morrison, I need you to run a background check on someone for me." "Classified level." "The name is Sarah Martinez, 17 years old, from Charlotte, North Carolina." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus, what's this about? Why do you need a classified background check on a teenager?" Henderson briefly explained the day's events, describing Sarah's extraordinary performance and her references to her grandfather's military and post-military career. "I'll make some calls," General Morrison said finally. "But Marcus, if this girl is who I think she might be, you may have stumbled onto something very sensitive." "What do you mean?" "I'll get back to you tomorrow. Don't discuss this with anyone else until you hear from me." The line went dead, leaving Henderson with more questions than answers. The next morning, Henderson arrived at his office to find a sealed envelope marked "Classified" on his desk. Inside was a single-page summary that made him understand why General Morrison had been so cautious. Sarah Martinez was indeed the granddaughter of Gunnery Sergeant Roberto "Ghost" Martinez, a Force Reconnaissance Marine who had served with distinction in Vietnam. After leaving the Marines, Roberto Martinez had worked for over 20 years with a classified government organization that conducted operations in hostile territories around the world. But the most shocking revelation was in the final paragraph. Roberto Martinez had not simply been training his granddaughter for general preparedness. According to the file, he had been targeted for elimination by hostile foreign agents in 2018. The threat had been neutralized, but not before Martinez realized that his family might also be at risk. The intensive training he had provided to Sarah was not recreational or educational. It was survival preparation. Henderson's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Colonel Henderson, this is Sarah. I was wondering if I could speak with you privately today. There are some things I should have told you yesterday." An hour later, Sarah sat across from Henderson in his office. Gone were the casual clothes and cheerful demeanor. She wore simple black clothing and carried herself with a seriousness that made her appear older than her 17 years. "Colonel," she began, "I wasn't completely honest with you yesterday about my grandfather's background or my training." Henderson gestured for her to continue. "My grandfather was Roberto Martinez. I suspect you've probably learned more about him since yesterday." Henderson nodded. "I have, but I'd like to hear your version of the story." Sarah took a deep breath. "Grandpa worked for an organization that conducted operations in places where regular military couldn't go. He made enemies, dangerous people who didn't forget or forgive. When I was 12, someone tried to kill him. They missed him but almost killed my grandmother instead." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "That's when he decided I needed to learn to protect myself. Not just basic self-defense, but real skills that could keep me alive if his enemies ever came after me." "And your father? Does he know about this?" Sarah shook her head. "Dad thinks I just learned to shoot at Grandpa's ranch. He has no idea about the real training or the reasons for it. Grandpa thought it was better that way." Henderson studied the young woman sitting across from him. Yesterday he had seen her as a remarkable shooter. Today he was beginning to understand that she was something else entirely. A teenager who had been trained as if her life might depend on it. "Sarah, why are you telling me this now?" "Because yesterday proved that I can't hide my abilities anymore," she replied. "Grandpa always said that if I ever demonstrated my full skills in public, there might be consequences. People would ask questions, and some of those people might be dangerous." Henderson felt a chill. "Are you saying you're in danger now?" "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly. "But Grandpa taught me to always have a plan. He said if I ever had to reveal my abilities, I should find someone trustworthy in law enforcement or the military who could help me if needed." "And you chose me?" Sarah managed a slight smile. "Actually, I chose Fort Bragg. You just happened to be the one in charge when I made my reservation." Henderson leaned back in his chair, processing everything he had learned. Sarah, what exactly are you asking of me? I'm asking for your advice, Colonel. And maybe your help if things go wrong. Grandpa died 6 months ago and I've been on my own since then. Yesterday was supposed to be a test to see if his training had prepared me for the real world. And what's your assessment? I think I passed the shooting test, Sarah said with dry humor. But I'm not sure I'm ready for whatever might come next. Henderson made a decision that would change both their lives. Sarah, I'm going to make some calls. There are people in the government who specialize in protecting individuals like you, but in the meantime I want you to stay close to Fort Bragg. Can you do that? Sarah nodded. Dad and I are staying at a hotel in Fayetteville for the rest of the week. He thinks this is just a vacation. Good. I'm also going to assign Staff Sergeant Williams to work with you on some additional training. If you're going to be prepared for threats, you need to understand more than just marksmanship. Over the following days, Henderson watched as Sarah worked with Williams on advanced tactical training. Her progress was extraordinary, but what impressed him most was her maturity and dedication. She approached every lesson with the seriousness of someone who understood that her life might depend on what she learned. On Friday evening, Henderson received a call that he had been both expecting and dreading. Colonel, this is Agent Maria Santos with the U.S. Marshals Service. I understand you've been working with Sarah Martinez this week. That's correct. We need to bring her in for protective custody immediately. We've intercepted communications suggesting that hostile agents are aware of her location and capabilities. Henderson felt his blood run cold. How much time do we have? Unknown. But we need to move tonight. Within 2 hours, Sarah and her father were in federal protective custody. Henderson never saw her again, but he received occasional updates through classified channels. Sarah was relocated under a new identity and provided with ongoing protection and training through a classified government program. Years later, Henderson would sometimes wonder what became of the remarkable teenager who had shattered every record at his shooting range. He never learned the details, but he occasionally heard rumors about a young woman working in classified operations who had become something of a legend among those who knew. The official records of Sarah Martinez's visit to Fort Bragg were classified and sealed. But Henderson kept copies of her shooting scores in his personal files, not as evidence of what had happened, but as a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary people come in the most unexpected packages. Colonel Chuckles Henderson never made assumptions about civilians again, and whenever young people visited his range, he remembered Sarah Martinez and the lesson she had taught him. Never underestimate someone based on their appearance or age. The girl who had walked onto his range in a pink hoodie and sneakers had not only broken every record, but had also broken his preconceptions about what was possible. In doing so, she had reminded him why he had joined the military in the first place: to protect people who deserved protection, even when those people were more capable than anyone could have imagined. Sarah Martinez had come to Fort Bragg as a test of her grandfather's training. She left as a legend that would be whispered about in military circles for years to come. And Colonel Henderson, who had started the day expecting to chuckle at another overconfident civilian, ended up with a story that would define the rest of his career.